lecture video is going to go over some of the basics involved in the lymphatic system. So there's two videos that kind of go together. The first one's going to look a little bit at basic function and some of the circulation that's involved in the lymphatic system, and then the second one will kind of focus on those nodules. So first of all, the lymphatic system is an underrated system in the body for sure, but it plays a really important job. Number one, it helps with fluid balance, so making sure that we are not retaining too much water or that we are not getting rid of too much water. It plays a role in fat absorption, and then it plays a role in our immune system, so it helps keep our bodies healthy. The major organs of the lymphatic system include the spleen, the thymus gland, various lymphatic vessels, and then the lymph nodes. The lymphatic system refers to a system of vessels that works very closely with the circulatory system. So that's kind of why we have it in this particular unit, so that you can kind of see how it works together with the blood vessels that we've talked about during class. So what is lymph? Well, lymph is a clear, watery liquid that is formed from interstitial fluid. So this is going to be fluid that's going to be found in between our cells. So our cells are floating around in all of this watery liquid environment, and that liquid environment is referred to as interstitial fluid. Now, what happens is that as blood flows through the blood vessels, so the arteries and the veins, some fluids inevitably leak out into the surrounding tissue. So we talked about how blood is full of plasma and proteins and water and blood cells, the formed elements, all of those white blood cells, all of those things. But that blood, some of that fluid, as the blood flowing through those fluids, are going to leak out into the interstitial fluid, so into those surrounding tissues. About 90% of the interstitial fluid is going to just diffuse right back into those capillaries and go right back into circulation. But about 10% is going to actually stay away from the capillaries, and it's going to enter into the lymphatic vessels. So when interstitial fluid then enters back into the lymph vessels, we rename it lymph, because it's within those vessels. But really, just know that it's the same interstitial fluid that existed before. It's just that because it's within those vessels, we're actually going to rename it lymph. Now, unlike blood vessels, which is going to have a kind of an open loop, lymph vessels are going to be dead end. They're going to end in lymph capillaries. So you can look here. Here is all of these tissue cells, or the cells that would make up the tissues. So about 90% of that tissue can end up going right back into our blood supply, but a 10% is going to go into these lymph vessels here, which are located right here in the green. So here's your veins, your venule, here's your arterial. Sometimes I think it's nice on your diagrams to kind of color these, so that it's a little bit easier to see these green vessels here representing the lymph, and then the veins and the arteries. So how do the lymph capillaries collect lymph? So unlike blood vessels, like I mentioned, that are all connected together, right? Our arteries merge into capillaries, which merge into veins, and we have this continuous loop. But lymph is a little bit different because they have dead ends, which are called lymph capillaries. So there, you can see here how the lymph vessel is going to stop. It's not going to continue on at some point. So what happens is that these lymph capillaries, so again, they're going to be 1 cell thick, are going to be lined with overlapping epithelial cells. And these overlapping cells, so you can see right here, this cell, and then it's overlapping this cell. And so there are these little gaps or flaps that end up forming. And this is what's going to allow fluid to enter into the lymph capillaries. These capillaries then are going to continue, and just like with blood vessels, they're going to end up merging together to form larger vessels, which we refer to as lymph vessels. So lymph vessels will eventually become very small lymph capillaries, and vice versa. So really, when we talked about arteries, we talked about arteries going into forming capillaries, which then connect to veins. While lymphs are a little different, we're going to start with those capillaries, and then they're going to merge together to form bigger lymph vessels. And there are valves that are located in this vessel, and it's not really pictured on this diagram, but you could kind of draw one in if you wanted to. But valves within the vessels that help prevent the backflow of fluid. So we want fluid to be moving in one direction, just like within our circulatory system. We kind of want everything moving in one direction, and the lymph in our lymph vessels is the same. We want them to kind of be merging in one direction. So you got these overlapping cells. Let's see, I don't know if you want to, but I can kind of draw this. Oops, oh, here we go. Here's this, shows you these valves, how these valves kind of open and shut. So once the lymph travels through, then the valve will shut, and then you end up with lymph fluid that's going to move into one direction. And again, that fluid's going to be entering in those little gaps from the overlapping cells so if all of this was your tissues, it will be coming into through that interstitial fluid. So unlike blood, which gets pumped by our bodies, our lymph actually doesn't pump like blood. Instead, basically every time you move, the skeletal muscles are going to put pressure on these capillaries. They're kind of going to squeeze on them. And that pressure is kind of going to push the fluid along the lymph capillaries and the lymph vessels. So there's no pumping mechanism for lymph. It just relies all on our skeletal muscles. And so that's sometimes why people who don't use muscles can often retain or have water fluid issues, fluid imbalances, is because when you're not moving, you're not being able to push pressure on these different valves. Thus, the fluid can't flow and move the way that we need it to because there's no other pumping mechanism. So once we have the lymph in these vessels, then we want to deliver them to the next structure of the lymphatic system, which are lymph nodes. So what is a lymph node? Here's kind of what a lymph node looks like. So here's one of those lymphatic vessels. There's one here. There's a couple up here. So lymph nodes are going to be special structures that are surrounded by a capsule of connective tissue. So you can kind of see the capsule right here of connective tissue. And then there's also these trabeculae. Remember when we talked about bones, we talked about trabeculae, which is kind of like these needle-like structures. Well, these are different than the trabeculae in bones, but it's just the idea that there are these like branches or these kind of needle-looking like structures that are going to form the structure of the lymph nodes. So what happens is there are these centers here, these germinal centers inside the lymph nodes. And these germinal centers are going to be area where lymphocytes, so lymphocytes are going to be the cells of the lymphatic organs, are going to be going through really fast mitosis or really fast cellular division. So they're making a whole bunch of them. And these are going to be where our two immune cells are going to be formed, lymphocytes and monocytes. So when we talked about the white blood cells and we talked about the two kinds of agranulocytes, monocytes and lymphocytes, these are where they're made. They're made in these lymph nodes and in these germinal centers. So there's a lot of cell division going on in order to produce these kinds of cells. And then eventually those cells are going to be used by our immune system to fight off infections. So what happens is the lymph enters the lymph nodes through afferent vesicles. Okay, so let's just look back to this picture. So lymph is going to come from the lymph vessels, remember, so it went to the capillaries. Those capillaries join together to form vessels, lymph vessels, and those lymph vessels then are going to bring the lymph into these lymph nodes. Now, when we want to leave the lymph nodes, they're going to leave out those efferent vesicles. This actually helps slow down this process of coming in through the afferent vesicles and going out the efferent vesicles, slows down the lymph so it can be filtered. And then eventually the lymph is going to return through two large ducts in the chest called the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. And these ducts are going to merge with veins where the fluid will then re-enter the cardiovascular system. So your lymph is going to be very connected to our cardiovascular system, because eventually they're going to drop everything into all of the lymph that's made into the cardiovascular system. So again, if you go back to this diagram here, just because I think it's a good one, you can kind of draw your arrows in if you want to, but so we would have capillaries up here. Again, it would branch, they would merge together to form these lymphatic vessels. These are the afferent lymphatic vessels. So the lymph will end up coming into here. Lymphocytes and monocytes are being made, and then it'll circulate through and it'll exit out here, the efferent lymphatic vessels, and then these efferent lymphatic vessels will eventually merge with veins in your right lymphatic duct, and then a vein in your thoracic duct, and deliver that back into the circulatory system. So then those lymphocytes and those monocytes can be traveling through the circulatory system to help fight infection, which is what we want them to do. So that's kind of a short explanation of how lymph circulates through the body. And if we just want to summarize it, so lymph is collected from interstitial tissue between the cells. It squeezes into the lymph capillaries. It travels to the lymph nodes through larger lymph vessels where it gets filtered, and then it is returned to the cardiovascular system through the ducts.